Razil had always been a dreamer. Even as a child, he spent his days poring over the tomes of chemistry that his family had amassed over generations. But while his relatives contented themselves with the simple alchemical formulas that had sustained the Darkroot clan for centuries, Razil yearned for something greater. He wanted to create the impossible, to turn base metals into gold, and unlock the secrets of the universe. For years, Razil worked tirelessly, pouring all of his energy and resources into his research. He scoured the countryside for rare and exotic materials, experimented with new processes and techniques, and pored over ancient texts and manuscripts in search of the answers he sought. He spent every waking moment in his laboratory, rarely venturing outside except to gather supplies or seek out new sources of inspiration. Despite his best efforts, however, Razil's quest for alchemical enlightenment remained elusive. For every breakthrough he made, there were a dozen more dead ends and false starts. He spent countless hours and vast sums of money in pursuit of his dream, but it always seemed to be just out of reach. Then one day, he had a revelation. If he could not transmute metals into gold, he would transmute something else entirely, something much larger and more valuable. He would turn an entire mountain into a glittering hoard of the precious metal, a feat that would cement his place in the annals of history, and make him the greatest alchemist of all time. With renewed vigor, Razil set to work. He pored over maps and charts, searching for the perfect mountain to transmute. He gathered every alchemical substance he could get his hands on, mixing and refining them into powerful tinctures and potions. He built elaborate apparatus and devices, each one more complex and intricate than the last. For 2 decades, Razil toiled in secret, pouring his heart and soul into his grand experiment. He barely slept, surviving on a meager diet of gruel and water, his eyes bloodshot and his hands trembling from exhaustion. But he never wavered, driven by the singular purpose of his quest. Finally, the day arrived. Razil stood atop the chosen mountain, his vast network of alchemical equipment humming and whirring around him. He raised his hands to the sky, feeling the power of the universe coursing through his veins, and began to chant the ancient words of transmutation. For a moment, it seemed as though the very fabric of reality was bending to his will. The mountain shook and shuddered, its rocky peaks and crags melting and twisting into gleaming veins of pure gold. Razil laughed with joy, his heart pounding with the thrill of victory. But as the last echoes of his incantation faded into the distance, something went terribly wrong. The mountain, no longer held together by its natural structure, began to crumble and collapse in on itself. Huge boulders and chunks of gold crashed down around Razil, burying him in a shower of molten rock and dust. When he finally emerged dazed and bleeding from the wreckage of his experiment, he found himself surrounded by a sea of destruction. The once beautiful mountain was now a desolate wasteland, strewn with rubble and debris. Villages and towns for miles around had been obliterated, their inhabitants crushed and suffocated beneath the weight of Razil's folly. Shocked and horrified by the scale of his failure, Razil fled from the scene of his crime. But he knew that he could never truly escape his past, or the consequences of his actions. He would be hunted down, arrested, and imprisoned for the rest of his days. It was hopeless. Several weeks passed, and Razil languished in his cell, consumed with guilt and regret. He had always known that his quest for alchemical power was risky, but he had never imagined the scale of the devastation it would cause. Now, as he sat alone in his cramped, squalid cell, he was tormented by the knowledge that he had caused irreparable harm to countless innocent people. One day, a new prisoner was brought to his cell. At first, Razil paid him no attention, assuming that he was just another criminal who had been thrown in jail. But as the days wore on, he began to take a closer interest in his cellmate. The man was enormous, easily twice Razil's size, and covered in thick, matted fur. He had a fearsome scowl on his face, and spent most of his time brooding in silence. Razil realized that his cellmate was an ogre, one of the brutish, violent creatures that roamed the wilderness beyond the city walls. He had heard stories of their ferocity, their insatiable hunger for human flesh. But something about the ogre's demeanor intrigued him. Despite his formidable appearance, there was a hint of intelligence and cunning in his eyes. And when Razil spoke to him, he seemed to understand more than he let on. Over the course of several days, Razil struck up a conversation with the ogre. He learned that his name was Gringur, and that he had been captured by the city guard while raiding a nearby farm. Razil told him about his own misadventures in alchemy, explaining how he had failed to transmute the mountain, and caused a great disaster in the process. To his surprise, Gringur listened intently to his tale, nodding at all the right moments. When Razil finished, the ogre grunted in what might have been approval, and held out his hand. "Give me something to drink," he said. Razil hesitated, unsure of what the ogre meant. But as he looked into Gringur's eyes, he saw a glint of something that he had never noticed before. It was a spark of curiosity, of wonder, of the same yearning for knowledge that had driven Razil all his life. And suddenly, he knew what to do. He rummaged through his meager supplies, searching for the ingredients he needed. He found a handful of moldy bread and some mossy stones, mixed them together in a flask, and poured in a vial of his most potent alchemical reagents. He stirred the mixture until it bubbled and fizzed, then handed it to Gringur. The ogre hesitated for a moment, sniffing the flask warily. Then, with a shrug, he gulped down the entire contents in one swallow. At first, nothing happened. Gringur stood there staring blankly ahead, his massive arms crossed over his chest. But then slowly, his body began to change. His muscles bulged and rippled, his fur stood on end, and his eyes widened with a wild feral glee. Razil watched in amazement as the ogre began to grow in size, swelling to twice his previous height. His skin turned a deep, dark shade of green, and his tusks extended to sharp, jagged points. And then, with a roar that shook the walls of the cell, Gringur charged at the door, slamming it with a force that should have shattered it to splinters. But instead of breaking apart, the door crumpled inward, twisted and warped by the ogre's incredible strength. As the dust settled, Razil gazed in awe at the wreckage around him. The door to their cell was gone, reduced to a pile of splinters and twisted metal. The walls were cracked and crumbling, and a thick cloud of dust hung in the air. And in the center of it all stood Gringur, panting heavily, but grinning from ear to ear. Without a word, the ogre lumbered over to Razil, scooped him up in one massive hand, and hoisted him onto his shoulder. And then, with a thunderous bellow that echoed across the forest, he charged out into the night. For weeks, the two of them roamed the countryside, scouring the land for the ingredients they needed to complete Razil's alchemical transmutation. They battled fierce monsters, outwitted cunning bandits, and braved treacherous natural hazards, never once losing sight of their goal. And finally, after many long and grueling months, they returned to the foot of the mountain where it had all begun. Razil gazed up at the towering peak, feeling a sense of awe and trepidation wash over him. But this time, he was not alone. Beside him stood Gringur, his loyal companion and fearsome ally, ready to face whatever lay ahead. With a deep breath, Razil reached into his pack and withdrew a small vial of shimmering liquid. He uncorked it, and as the contents spilled out, a blinding flash of light filled the air. When it faded, the mountain was gone, replaced by an enormous pile of glittering gold. For a moment, Razil and Gringur stood there, staring in wonder at their accomplishment. And then, with a grin, the ogre swept up a handful of gold, tossed it into the air, and began to dance in wild abandon. Razil laughed, feeling a sense of joy and triumph that he had never known before. Together, they had accomplished the impossible. They had harnessed the power of alchemy, and transformed a mountain into gold. And as they stood there, basking in the glow of their success, they knew that nothing in the world could stop them.